Welcome. Today we're taking a close look at the history, the really remarkable and difficult production, and the legacy of what is, I think, one of the most important pieces of American cinema ever made, Steven Spielberg's 1998 epic, Saving Private Ryan.
And our focus for you today is very specific.
It is. We're not just going to summarize the plot. Most of you know it very, very well.
Right. Instead, we're going to explore all these sources we have surrounding the making of the film, the deep historical roots of that central conflict, and just the profound cultural shockwaves it created.
Shockwaves that are still being felt, really, a quarter century later.
Absolutely. We're going beyond what you see on screen. We're going to analyze the creative intent, behind the camera. That almost painful commitment to authenticity, the intense psychological conditioning the cast went through.
And the visual techniques that just completely redefined war cinema.
And how this one movie forced Hollywood, and really audiences all over the world, to rethink how we visualize and remember the Second World War.
The sources we have for this are incredibly rich. There are detailed accounts of where the idea came from, the casting process, that commitment to realism.
Right, including technical details that most viewers would never even notice.
And the immediate, very serious effects the film had on veterans, on the media, and on filmmaking itself.
So let's get into it. Let's unpack this monumental film, starting with what you could call the historical imperative. The real-life policy that made Captain Miller's mission feel so authentic.
The core idea of saving Private Ryan, risking 8 lives to save one, it feels like this terrible existential problem. But our sources confirm it wasn't just a fictional device. It was rooted in a genuine, tragic, real-life policy, a response to just overwhelming family loss in wartime.
And we're talking mainly about the Niland brothers.
Exactly.
What's really fascinating here is if you trace where the concept came from, because the final film was this sort of confluence of personal heartbreak and long-standing military policy.
So where did the writer, Robert Roda, get the initial idea?
Well, it wasn't from the Nilands, that specifically. It came from something simpler and just heartbreaking. He saw a monument in New Hampshire.
Just a local monument.
Yeah, and it listed several sets of brothers who were killed in combat. He was quoted saying that the idea of a family losing multiple sons in a war was just inconceivable to him.
Yeah.
And that emotional reaction, that sense of a family's entire history being erased by war, that was the initial spark.
So that's the emotional anchor. But the specific mission, finding the last surviving son, that was directly modeled on the Niland brothers' tragedy during World War II.
Precisely. The Nilands, they were from Tonawanda, New York. 4 sons, all serving overseas. In 1944, 2 of them were confirmed killed in action. One in Normandy, one in the Pacific.
And a third was missing?
A third son, Edward, an airman, was shot down and initially presumed dead. So when all this was reported back home, just devastating.
I can't even imagine.
So the U.S. Army moved fast. They located the 4th son, Frederick Fritz Niland, who was serving with the 101st Airborne in Normandy, and they shipped him home immediately.
To prevent the complete loss of that family line.
Exactly. And as a small postscript, Edward, the brother who was presumed dead, he was later found alive in a Japanese POW camp.
That's incredible. And this wasn't just a one-off response, was it? This protection policy, the sole survivor policy, it had precedent.
It did. It goes back a long way in U.S. military history, well over 80 years before World War II.
So the order in the film, the one given by General George C. Marshall to find James Francis Ryan, that was based on real historical policies.
Correct. If you trace the tradition, it runs straight back through American history.
Yeah.
In the Civil War, you had the 5 Bixby brothers,
Right.
4 of whom died in battle. After that loss, President Abraham Lincoln wrote a very famous letter to their grieving mother, Lydia Bixby.
And even more immediate, the precedent that really must have been on everyone's mind in WWII was the Sullivan brothers.
Absolutely. The 5 Sullivan brothers. They insisted on serving together on the same ship, the USS Juno.
And the ship was sunk.
It was, off Guadalcanal in November 1942. All 5 of them were killed in action. That loss was such a profound national shock that it directly influenced the War Department to formalize regulations about how many members of one family could serve in combat together.
So the mission in the film isn't just a plot device, it's a reflection of a policy born from deep national sorrow.
And General Marshall's letter in the film, the one commanding the search, it actually quotes Lincoln's Bixby letter. It links this desperate mission directly to that national memory of sacrifice.
A recognition that some losses were just too much for the country to bear.
And this historical weight was really amplified by the director. Spielberg's motivation here wasn't just about making a great movie. It was deeply personal.
He grew up with the history of that conflict, didn't he?
He did. He saw the whole project as a tribute to his father, Arnold Spielberg, who was a U.S. Army veteran.
Right, he served in the China-Burma theater.
He did. And Spielberg described WWII as the seminal conversation in his family. His parents talked constantly about the war, about the Holocaust. He became obsessed with it because of his father's stories.
And that personal connection drove his whole approach. He was determined to avoid the kind of sanitized war that Hollywood usually produced.
He went through a major shift. He admitted that, at first, he considered making something like a Boy's Own style adventure.
Something clean, heroic.
Traditional, yeah. But then he did all these interviews with WWI veterans for research, and it changed everything. They all came to him with basically the same plea.
What did they say?
Please be honest about it.
Oh.
They urged him, please don't make another Hollywood movie about WWII. Please tell our stories as they were.
That must have completely changed his perspective. From making entertainment to, well, historical duty?
It did. He realized previous films were, sentimentalized. They presented combat as only honor and glory, which he found wholly untrue. The real courage he felt was in facing this palpable, blinding terror.
So he wanted to capture the disorientation, the sensory assault, not just choreographed action.
Exactly. The veterans didn't describe clear battlefields. They described the charge up Omaha Beach as a total, incomprehensible blur.
A blur.
Yeah. They remembered every grain of sand because their faces were buried in it, but everything else, the objectives, the enemy, it was all just a disoriented mess.
So he aimed for sensory overload.
Precisely. The veteran interviews emphasized the extreme physical experience. It wasn't just gunfire. It was the violent, bone-rattling vibrations from every shell hitting the beach.
They talked about concussions causing bloody noses, rattling their ears.
And the ground literally slamming into their faces.
Yeah.
Spielberg was determined to immerse the audience in that specific chaos.
And the historian Stephen Ambrose, who consulted on the film, he felt the same way about older war movies.
He did. Ambrose really disliked those glorified depictions of Normandy that just ignored the reality of the wounded. He stressed the suffering of soldiers dying slowly in the mud, wishing for their mothers they wanted morphine.
So Spielberg saw this as a necessary cinematic antidote.
He did. And that meant the script needed to reflect that radical realism. Even Rodat's initial script, which was well-researched, it needed some key refinements.
And that's where the uncredited rewrites came in.
Right. Spielberg brought on Frank Darabont and Scott Frank to enhance the raw realism. And Darabont suggested one crucial, simple change to the opening.
Which was?
Instead of starting with the first wave hitting relatively clear beaches, he said the sequence should start with the second wave arriving.
And the implication of that change is massive.
It instantly heightens the sense of doom. The soldiers aren't just facing enemy fire, they're walking directly into hell on earth.
Stepping over the bodies of the first wave.
Forcing them to confront failure and carnage before they've even fired a shot. It just ratchets up the chaos immediately.
And the final emotional bookend of the film, the cemetery scene, that was also a deeply personal moment for Spielberg.
It was. The final scene, with the elderly James Ryan at Captain Miller's grave, was based entirely on a personal experience. As a young man, Spielberg was visiting the cemetery and saw a man openly crying at a grave marker, surrounded by his family.
And that moment stuck with him.
It became the necessary frame for the whole story. It confirms the film's theme that the debt owed to the fallen is a lifelong burden.
So moving from the concept to the execution, the casting was obviously critical, but it also revealed some really strategic choices by Spielberg. He was trying to manufacture credibility, not just hire famous actors.
Credibility was everything. Spielberg felt strongly that the stress of combat would make young soldiers look much older than they were, so he wanted actors who could convey that weariness.
Especially for Captain John H. Miller.
Exactly. And the choice of Tom Hanks for that role was really foundational.
Because he wasn't the typical macho hero.
Right. Spielberg specifically chose Hanks because he was the only actor he could think of who wouldn't want to use his teeth to pull out a pin from a hand grenade.
Meaning he projected calmness and vulnerability.
Yes, professionalism, but also vulnerability. Hanks himself said he based the character on the history of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. He believed Miller was horribly afraid of getting his men killed.
And that's where the trembling hand comes from.
It is, that constant physical manifestation of his internal struggle.
And the rest of the squad was intentionally diverse, a kind of microcosm of the American forces.
It was. You have Adam Goldberg as the Jewish trooper, Mellish. Vin Diesel as the Italian Caparzo. And the stories behind some of these supporting roles are really interesting.
Like Vin Diesel.
Yeah, he had been struggling, working as a telemarketer. Spielberg saw his independent films, Multifacial and Strays, and was so impressed he created a small role just for him.
And then, of course, there's Private Ryan himself, Matt Damon. Spielberg wanted an everyman, but that kind of backfired, didn't it?
The intention was sound. He wanted a relatively unknown actor with that great American every boy look.
So Ryan would seem like a total stranger to the audience and the squad.
Exactly, yeah. But Spielberg had no idea that Good Will Hunting was about to explode and turn Damon into a global superstar right before Saving Private Ryan came out.
So he ended up being the most famous, unknown actor in Hollywood.
Pretty much.
Now, we have to talk about the most famous piece of the pre-production. The boot camp.
Yeah.
This sounds less like rehearsal and more like intentional psychological conditioning.
It was absolutely intentional. It was suggested by Hanks and the film's technical advisor, the retired U.S. Marine Captain Dale Dye, who ran the camp.
And all the main actors went through it.
All of them, with one very major exception. And it was a grueling 6-day simulated boot camp. They wanted the actors to truly understand the cold, wet, miserable conditions.
Can you describe what they actually went through?
It was extreme. They got only 3 hours of sleep a night. They were constantly cold and wet. They did 5-mile runs with full packs and gear.
And they were punished for mistakes.
Oh, yeah. Any mistake in weapons handling or tactics meant immediate punitive exercise. Mass push-ups, that sort of thing.
Right.
The whole point was to get them to a state of absolute physical and mental exhaustion.
To break down that polished actor facade.
And expose their raw, natural reactions.
It's hard to imagine big Hollywood stars agreeing to that. Did they ever think about quitting?
They absolutely did. The sources say that on multiple occasions, the actors wanted to quit.
But Tom Hanks kept them there.
He did. Even though he was the biggest star, he convinced them to stay. He told them they'd regret walking away, that this shared painful history was vital to understanding their characters' fear and their reliance on each other.
And that earned him a lot of respect.
Deep and lasting respect. Dale Dye made sure that memory carried through the whole shoot, constantly reminding them of their training to keep that authenticity.
And then there's the masterstroke of psychological manipulation, keeping Matt Damon out of the whole thing.
That was pure directorial brilliance. It was designed to generate real, authentic on-screen conflict.
So the rest of the cast, who had bonded through misery and exhaustion,
would genuinely resent Matt Damon, both the man and the character he played, Private James Ryan.
So the conflict in the script wasn't just acted, it was based on real friction.
Exactly. It immediately reinforced that central question. Why should they, these suffering comrades, risk their lives and their bond for this unknown, clean, rested outsider? It gave the actors a real emotional well to draw from.
We should also mention Tom Sizemore, who played Sergeant Horvath. His casting came with some pretty high-stakes conditions.
It did. Sizemore had a history of drug addiction. Spielberg recognized his talent. He was perfect for the role, but he needed absolute reliability.
So he mandated regular drug tests.
Regular surprise drug tests throughout the entire shoot, and the penalty was severe.
Yeah.
If he failed a test, he was fired, his role would be recast, and all his scenes would be reshot immediately.
That's a huge production risk.
It is, but it shows how committed Spielberg was to the cohesion of his core group. And Sizemore himself, reflecting on Horvath, said his character's tragic flaw was not knowing when it was time to say, I can't do this anymore.
That sense of relentless duty.
It defined his performance, and it kind of mirrored the intense pressure put on the actors themselves.
The psychological prep of the actors set the stage, but what truly cemented this film's legacy was the revolutionary visual and sonic language it used. It didn't just show you combat, it dragged you into the physical chaos of it.
That aesthetic transformation was really driven by the cinematographer Janusz Kaminski and Spielberg. They spent weeks testing cameras and film stocks.
They considered shooting it in black and white, like Schindler's List.
They did, but they ultimately felt it would seem pretentious for a film focused on visceral reality. So they decided to emulate the look of actual colored WWII documentary footage, but with a very intentional, degraded aesthetic.
And to get that look, they used some pretty counterintuitive methods.
They deliberately sabotaged their own state-of-the-art cameras. Kaminski intentionally stripped the protective coating off some of the lenses.
The anti-reflective layer.
Exactly. That coating is there to give you a crystal clear image and control lens flares. By removing it, the image became flatter, degraded, and it created these light blooms and uncontrolled flares that mimic the imperfect optics of WWII-era cameras.
So they were adding imperfections to create a sense of time and place.
They were. They also intentionally mismatched lenses. One camera might have a stripped lens, another a standard one. It made this huge, high-budget production look like it was haphazardly shot by a bunch of combat cameramen under fire.
And the motion itself, the constant movement, the handheld camera work, that's what defines the film.
It was almost all shot that way. It demanded extreme physical effort from the camera operators. They had to stay low, at the soldiers' level, navigating explosions, making the audience feel like a participant, not a spectator.
They even let fake blood and sands stick to the lens.
Right, which they believe just enhanced that gritty, in-the-moment authenticity.
And what about that shaking effect during bombardments? The one that makes you feel the concussive force.
There was a special piece of gear called the Claremont Camera Image Shaker. It literally vibrates the camera violently to simulate the physical effect of nearby explosions. But they didn't stop there. They also messed with the camera shutter.
What does manipulating the shutter do visually?
It creates a specific jarring effect. By using a fast shutter speed and a narrow angle, it removes most of the motion blur. So each individual frame is super sharp, and it gives the action this nervous, stuttering, hyper-real quality.
It makes explosions feel incredibly immediate.
It does. It was a risky move because if it didn't work, you couldn't fix it in post-production.
Let's talk about the sets. The scale of the Omaha Beach recreation is just mind-boggling.
The real Normandy beaches were too developed, so they couldn't film there. They settled on Ballinsker Beach in Ireland, and that Omaha Beach sequence alone took 4 weeks to film and cost about $12 million.
Just for that one scene.
Just for that one scene. The logistics were monumental. They built all the historical fortifications, but they also had about 1,500 people on set.
Including 1,000 Irish Army soldiers as extras.
Right, and critically, dozens of non-actor extras, including about 30 amputees and paraplegics who were fitted with prosthetics to accurately portray the severely wounded soldiers.
We have to pause on that detail. The commitment was so extreme they were making sure the injuries were authentic, even down to who they cast as extras.
It says everything about the level of historical commitment. Every detail mattered. They had dead fish strewn in the water based on veteran interviews. They used thousands of gallons of fake blood.
Which had to have blue coloring mixed in so it would look dark red on film.
Exactly, because of the Technicolor ENR process they used. Even the bullet impacts were engineered with air pipes hidden under the sand, making the ground erupt realistically.
And beyond D-Day, they had to build the entire fictional town of Ramelle from scratch.
They did, at the Hatfield Aerodrome in England. The set was colossal, covering nearly 3 city blocks. They built a custom 900-foot-long riverbed just so they could control the water height for the final tank battle.
Incredible control, just to make it look completely ruined and chaotic.
Precisely.
And finally, let's talk about the sound, or really the deliberate absence of music during the combat scenes.
That was a foundational choice. Spielberg stripped away the traditional orchestral swells of war movies. He wanted the visceral, chaotic, agonizing sounds of battle. The ringing in your ears, the screams, the muffled explosions.
That must have been a unique challenge for his longtime composer, John Williams.
It was. Williams had to deliberately avoid anything grandiose or operatic. The final score is only about 55 minutes long and is mostly reserved for transitional moments.
And Spielberg had a very specific request for how it was recorded.
He did. He wanted it recorded with the Boston Symphony Orchestra at Symphony Hall, not a soundstage. He said on a soundstage, you don't hear the air. He wanted the rich, warm acoustics of the hall itself to be part of the sound.
And the final signature look, that muted color palette, was achieved in post-production.
Yes, using that Technicolor ENR process. It involved a technique called silver retention. Comiskey chose a 70% desaturation, so they chemically removed 70% of the color.
And that created deeper blacks and that signature blue-green hue.
Exactly. It contrasted sharply with the fully colorful scenes set back in America.
Despite all this, Spielberg was worried the violence would push the rating too high.
He was. He worried about getting an NC-17. But he correctly guessed the MPAA would consider the historical importance of the content and give it an R rating. But it's important to know that some scenes were still trimmed because they were just too intense.
The death of Private Mellish is a really painful example of that.
It is. Mellish's death, where he's slowly stabbed by a German soldier, was initially even longer and more graphic. Spielberg's own projectionist told him that the sequence was too painful to watch.
So he trimmed it.
He trimmed the parts where the character was screaming in prolonged pain, a small concession to the audience, acknowledging the victim's suffering against the relentless horror.
That profound human cost, the fact that a scene had to be trimmed because it was just too painful. It shows how the film's realism went way beyond gore. It stripped away Hollywood heroics to look at the psychological and moral toll of war.
And Captain Miller's character is central to that. He is consciously portrayed as anything but the typical, infallible hero.
He's an experienced soldier, but he's haunted by the responsibility of command.
Deeply haunted. And that internal conflict is given that constant physical manifestation. His uncontrollably trembling hands.
Which is a clear sign of severe post-traumatic stress disorder, something you rarely saw in a WWII hero in film before this.
It's the unspoken toll of his leadership. Miller tries to rationalize everything to survive. He tells Horvath he rationalizes the 94 men who died under his command as necessary sacrifices to save many more lives. That logic is what keeps him sane.
But the mission to save Ryan just completely shatters that moral framework.
It does. Spielberg himself called the Ryan mission risking 8 professional soldiers for one unknown replacement, an immoral act to force upon soldiers. It makes Miller contradict his entire method for rationalizing loss.
And the moment he finally reveals his civilian identity as a teacher, that's such a critical turning point.
It's huge. Up until then, he refuses to say who he was. He insists his men would never guess, implying the war has completely redefined him. But when the mission is falling apart and his men are close to mutiny, he stops the standoff by finally revealing he was just a teacher and a baseball coach.
And why does that specific reveal matter so much?
Because it confirms that beneath the exhausted, battle-hardened commander, the decent, non-military human being is still in there, grasping to hold on to that past self. It's a moment of radical vulnerability that earns back the respect of his squad.
And the film's perspective actually shifts halfway through to the character of Timothy Upham, the interpreter.
Upham is the audience surrogate. He's the intellectual, well-meaning civilian who's read about war but has zero combat experience.
And Spielberg shifts the audience's perspective to him because he embodies pre-war morality.
He does. When they capture the German soldier, Steamboat Willie, Upham is the one who argues they have to follow the rules of war, treat him humanely. He's reflecting civilian morality.
But his arc is a tragic, irreversible transformation.
It is. Upham goes from moral arbiter to paralyzed observer to, in the end, an executioner. The peak of his failure is when he freezes, paralyzed by terror, as his friend Mellish is stabbed to death just one floor away. His intellect and decency are useless in that moment.
And the consequence of that paralysis
is that when he later encounters that same German prisoner, Steamboat Willie, he executes him in cold blood. And this, critics have said, is Spielberg's unspoken philosophical argument about combat.
That the horrors of war fundamentally and permanently change a person?
Turning decency into brutality when faced with the consequences of your own inaction.
The film is also praised for really challenging the simple archetypes of the good war narrative. It doesn't paint Allied soldiers as perfect heroes.
That refusal to simplify is central to its achievement. It shows Allied soldiers as brave, yes, but also as frightened civilians who are capable of great cruelty. We see it right away when 2 Allied soldiers are shown laughing as they execute pleading German prisoners.
And the film is even more complex when you realize who those executed prisoners might have been.
That's a crucial detail. If you listen closely, they're heard speaking Czech, which suggests they weren't fanatical Nazis, but maybe forcibly conscripted Czechs.
So victims on both sides are just victims of the conflict itself.
In that context, allegiances really do cease to matter. Germans are shown executing downed Americans, too. The sources suggest that in this film, all men are equal in their suffering and their capacity for atrocity.
And the mission only finds meaning when Horvath says that saving Ryan might be the one decent thing they can accomplish in this whole god-awful mess.
That's the turning point. That realization allows the men to decide to defend Rommel on their own terms, giving the mission a personal meaning beyond just following orders.
The film's approach to patriotism is also complicated. It avoids grand speeches about democracy.
The soldiers only talk about survival, about going home. Yet the film became part of this resurgence of national pride.
You could almost call it therapeutic patriotism.
That's a great way to put it. The film became a vehicle for a new interest in WWII, in the last good war, which aimed to rehabilitate the image of the modern soldier by referencing the greatest generation.
And all this complexity leads back to Miller's final, almost impossible instruction to Ryan.
earn this. When the elderly Ryan is at the grave, hoping he's fulfilled that command, the whole story is framed as a moral transaction. Critics called it a terrible, impossible order.
Imposing this unbearable moral debt that he has to carry for the rest of his life.
And the film suggests that the real homage owed to the fallen is simply the freedom they fought for and how the survivors choose to live their lives. A reminder that the fight continues even in peacetime.
That deep commitment to truth paid off immediately. The film's impact was huge, not just artistically, but commercially and culturally.
It was an enormous commercial success. It made $482.3 million worldwide. In the U.S., it was the highest-grossing film of 1998.
Which was significant because it proved that mass audiences would show up for serious, brutal, historical dramas, not just summer blockbusters.
It challenged the whole idea of a summer movie season.
But the cultural influence was tectonic. It reshaped America's collective memory of WWII.
It really did. It presented the grim and brutal reality of the war in a way audiences had never seen before on that scale. And this had immediate, serious, and sometimes devastating real-world consequences, especially for the veterans it was honoring.
The psychological impact was so acute that many veterans couldn't even finish watching the film.
They couldn't. The traumatic accuracy brought back intense, suppressed memories.
And this is where we have to slow down and really acknowledge the severity of that response. The impact was so great that the U.S. government had to intervene.
That's right. The United States Department of Veterans Affairs established a dedicated phone line just for viewers affected by the film.
A dedicated phone line for a movie.
Yes. And counselors reported a sharp, distinct increase in visits from veterans suffering from PTSD, demonstrating that this wasn't just entertainment. It was a serious national cultural reckoning that reopened old wounds.
And beyond that, the film completely reset the industry standard for how to depict conflict. It's universally called a game changer for action cinematography.
The visual template it established is everywhere now. The desaturated handheld blood splatters and all horror sequences that set the standard for almost all war and action cinema that followed.
Which filmmakers were influenced by it?
You see it everywhere. Christopher Nolan's approach in Dunkirk is a direct descendant. Quentin Tarantino acknowledged its influence on Inglourious Basterds. Even directors like Robert Altman recognized it had achieved something unique.
And that aesthetic, the camera up close to the action, the handheld movement, it's standard Hollywood language now.
You see it in Gladiator, Black Hawk Down, Hacksaw Ridge, even the way fight scenes are shot in modern superhero films. It changed the visual grammar.
And the influence didn't stop with movies, it crossed over into video games.
This is a critical long-tail piece of its legacy. Spielberg and his studio, DreamWorks, they saw that the film's realism could be translated into an interactive form. So they developed the Medal of Honor video game series.
Which launched in 1999.
Right. And that, in turn, directly shaped the current landscape of first-person shooters, which is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. The success of Medal of Honor is credited with contributing directly to the creation of the Call of Duty series.
So the film's vision of realistic WWII combat fundamentally changed how we interact with war in a digital space.
It did. It has this enduring cultural force that lasted decades beyond its theatrical run.
Despite all this acclaim, the film had a famously controversial night at the Academy Awards.
It remains one of the most debated outcomes in Oscar history. The film is widely seen as one of the greatest war films ever made, one of Spielberg's best. It won 5 Oscars, including Best Director.
But it lost Best Picture.
It lost Best Picture to Shakespeare in Love, an upset that critics still argue about today.
But regardless of that one loss, the film's permanent place in cinema history is undeniable.
It is. Its importance has been formally recognized. In 2014, it was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress.
Which means it's recognized as culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant?
Even decades later, it continues to get universal critical acclaim, solidifying its place as a defining piece of modern cinematic art. The ultimate lasting contribution of Saving Private Ryan was that it acted as a kind of cultural reckoning. It stripped away decades of cinematic sentimentality and forced audiences to confront the unvarnished reality of the sacrifice made by World War II soldiers. By doing that, it irrevocably shifted our collective memory of the conflict, and through its visuals, permanently altered the cinematic language used to depict combat.
We spent a lot of time analyzing that intense, impossible burden placed on Private Ryan by Captain Miller's final command to earn this sacrifice. If the film's most enduring legacy is teaching a new generation about the true, horrific cost of freedom, What does earning that sacrifice truly look like for us today, decades after we first saw this powerful story? Something to think about the next time you reflect on the film's legacy. Thanks for listening.